Welcome to Momentum for Change, Voices of the Missouri Movement. This is a monthly podcast produced by your coalition, and I am your host, Nora Mosby, a member services specialist at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. We hope that you enjoy this conversation coming to you directly from Voices of the Missouri Movement. Some episodes of Momentum for Change have conversations that include content and descriptions of domestic and sexual violence, which may be alarming or activating for some listeners. Please take care and visit the MOCADSV website or call our office to connect with supportive services. Hello and welcome to episode 7 of season 3 of Momentum for Change. This is your host, Nora Mosby, and I am a member services specialist at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. Momentum for Change is a podcast that we host here at MOCADSV to lift up voices of the Missouri movement. I am really looking forward to today's episode. For one reason, we are streaming and recording from our new studio. So thank you for all of your work on that, Tim Stillings, my coworker who set up the new studio. And I'm also really looking forward to today's episode because we have an incredible guest. Amy Lorenz-Moser is with us today. And Amy is with us today in recognition of the 25th anniversary of launching the Missouri Battered Women's Clemency Coalition, or the Missouri Clemency Project. And the Clemency Project, it was a very significant statewide effort here in Missouri. It brought together lawmakers, advocates, law students, attorneys, all working together from across the state. And it is a significant part of the history of the anti-violence movement here in Missouri. And so the project was launched 25 years ago this year, and in recognition of that, we have Amy Lorenz-Moser here. She's an attorney from St. Louis, and she's going to talk about her involvement in the Clemency Project and how she helped a number of incarcerated survivors of domestic violence gain clemency. So, Amy, thank you so much for being here. It truly is an honor to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
As we're getting started, Amy, can you tell our listeners just a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I am an attorney here in St. Louis, as you mentioned, in private practice. I have my own firm with a law partner, Carpenter Moser, and we do a lot of different trial work, civil litigation. And then, of course, one of the favorite parts of my practice is the pro bono cases that I do, which is some of what we're talking about today.
Absolutely, which you've done for quite a while and have a lot of experience in. You certainly obviously have a heart for philanthropy because in addition to your work doing pro bono cases, you also are on the MOCADSV board of directors. So thank you for your leadership there. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you got involved with the coalition?
Sure. First of all, it's an honor to be a part of the board of directors of the coalition. I think that they do amazing work. I first became familiar with the coalition back in the late 90s as a law student when we started the Clemency Project. Colleen Goebel and the coalition was extremely instrumental in bringing the different pieces together and moving forward a lot of the political part of what was happening with the project. And I think that had the coalition not had such strong advocates and expertise in those areas, that it might have been much less successful. So it's something that I have continued to interface with my different pro bono cases, and I am honored to sit on the board.
So you have been involved with the coalition for literally decades now. Well, thank you. It means a lot to have somebody with that much experience on our board, really shining a light for where we're going to go with this organization. So thank you so much for your service on the board, Amy. We appreciate it. And advocacy is something also that you have been involved in for decades. Supporting survivors of violence seems like it's really a calling for you. So how did you first get involved in work to support survivors of domestic violence?
Well, when I went to law school, one of the reasons that I went there to Mizzou specifically, as I was very interested in having an opportunity to work in the family violence clinic that they had at the time, and that they have recently brought back, which is amazing. So that project, that clinic is something that students have an opportunity to go represent survivors and things like orders of protection or children in orders of protection. And it gives you hands-on experience working with clients, and domestic violence was an issue that was near and dear to my heart. And I was very interested in trying to make a difference in that way. After I got there and got into the law clinic, it was made known to me that this group was forming to try to get these particular survivors out of prison who were serving life sentences or very long sentences without any evidence of the abuse being admitted at the trial. And my then teacher, Mary Beck, who is a wonderful person, an advocate, an attorney, asked me if I wanted to be a part of the group. And so I decided to do both things, and it was great.
So you were a young law student.
Sure.
And your first kind of introduction to advocacy and supporting survivors was working in the Clemency Project. That's pretty incredible.
I also did the family violence clinic. Yes, that was introduction 101 was let's go to prison and try to get these people out.
I think a lot of advocates who are tuning in and listening can relate to that. You often just hit the road running, but starting off with a clemency case is pretty significant. Wow, that's an incredible introduction to the movement, Amy.
The good part about doing something like that when you're very young is you don't know what you don't know. So you don't understand what a big undertaking it is, or, you know, how daunting something like that might be because you don't have anything to compare it to. So that gives you
It's so true. It's so true. And you're willing to work very hard and long hours. True. Yeah. Well, the Missouri Clemency Project, I think, has such an incredible origin story that I'd love to share with listeners, and please add to it. But the Clemency Project actually was the idea of a person from St. Louis, Missouri named Joe Church, who incidentally was at his 20th high school reunion. This was 1998. And he noticed that one of the high school students he had gone to school with was not there. And so in asking around, he found out that actually the student had been incarcerated, was a survivor of domestic violence who had been incarcerated for a crime committed against her husband, I believe. And so I think that he immediately identified the injustice in that, and it was a call to action for him. And somewhat serendipitously, it was the same high school class that our former CEO, Colleen Coble, had also gone to. And so he reached out to Colleen to see about what could be done to address this situation. And like, just what are all the chances that would have all fallen into place? And then Colleen got the law schools involved in order to get attorneys and law students involved in moving these clemency cases forward. That origin story is just all the right people at all the right times and all the relationships that had to exist in order for that to happen. It just feels like it was meant to be.
Absolutely. It's one of those things that had somebody graduated a year later, not from this person or whatever, you know, it was an issue that's time had come. I think that something would have eventually happened, but I don't know that this thing would.
Right. So as maybe you think back to the beginning of your work with the Clemency Project, or as you're talking to people now who've never heard of the project, how do you describe it to people? Like, what do you say about what it was and what it achieved?
Oh gosh, I guess that's kind of a big question.
It is.
So the way I describe it is that a group of attorneys, advocates, law students, and community members came together to try to right a wrong in our justice system, which was that there are all of these survivors in jail who had had trials, been convicted, were serving life with parole or life without parole, very long sentences.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody had ever heard about any of the abuse that they had suffered. That evidence was later found to be admissible at trials so that new people could use that to try to get an acquittal, but it didn't change any of their sentences. It was like the ultimate terrible loophole in the law.
And why hadn't their stories of domestic violence or other experiences of abuse been brought up in their original trials? Why wasn't that part of the original trials that they participated in?
So the issue was kind of twofold. First of all, at the time, the main vehicle that the introduction of this evidence comes in nowadays is battered women's syndrome jury instructions, kind of the old school way of saying it. But they basically would get an instruction that tells them that they can use evidence of this individual being an abused person to acquit them at the trial. That was not available at the time that case folks were put into prison and sentenced to these very, very long terms. If the killing hit is in the heat of battle, like you're in hand-to-hand combat with somebody, regardless of whether or not they were your spouse, that kind of evidence could come in. A lot of these situations where survivors are defending themselves aren't happening in that kind of a circumstance. There is knowledge on behalf of the survivor of the danger that they're in, even after the attack has ceased, or there's threats that are made that they know are real threats, that they are in extreme physical danger, and it is imminent, even though nobody's holding a gun to their head at that second. They know it's coming. So it's a recognition of that, essentially, that there are special circumstances when you look at these cases that have to do with dynamics involved in domestic violence. At the time that these women were convicted, there was very little understanding of domestic violence in terms of how it might affect self-defense, which is essentially what these cases are, self-defense cases. And so evidence of abuse at some other time was considered irrelevant and prejudicial, and they wouldn't allow it into evidence. They didn't allow that stuff to be brought up because it would be blaming the victim.
I see. Wow. So what period of time are we really talking about? Because it sounds like have things changed for the better, or are we still seeing these really harsh sentences on survivors of domestic violence?
So the women who were part of the original coalition, those convictions happened in the 70s and 80s. For the most part. They were before there was any statutory relief or any kind of laws that would allow that evidence to come in at trials, that would give people a chance to tell their story about the abuse that they suffered. And so there was certainty that these folks had very little chance to bring this up. Some of them did try to bring it up at their trial through various means, and either their lawyers encouraged them not to because it gave motive. If they can't use that to say you're not guilty, maybe the jury would use it to say that you had a reason to kill this person. So it was just a very different kind of thinking at that time. Some of it was excluded for other reasons, like what I said, that it was not relevant. There was also some bad lawyering in a lot of these cases where this evidence was not developed. And there wasn't very much effort to get it in. It's hard to say if it would have made much of a difference in some of the cases because it wasn't. So that is the category of cases that really started the project. The other category of cases, which have been some subsequent ones that I've taken, are cases where the law just didn't work correctly to allow that to come in. For instance, I had a case where lawyers didn't submit those instructions and didn't submit any corroborating evidence that would have documented the abuse. Uh, the survivor gets on the stand. She tells what happens to her. Prosecution raises her credibility as an issue, tries to say that she's making this up after the fact. And the attorneys don't put on other witnesses, documents, arrest reports, things that would have demonstrated she was telling the truth and that she had made this known to folks before the killing happened.
Right.
So it doesn't do any good if the jury doesn't know they can't use it to acquit you, or it doesn't know that they should believe you. Those types of things.
Right. And I think understanding the dynamics of domestic and sexual violence is so critical to understanding what has happened when there's these kinds of crimes that occur and what the appropriate judicial response should be. If you don't have that understanding of domestic violence, then it just doesn't add up in the same way. It doesn't make sense. And going back to something that you talked about a little bit earlier, I think about how sometimes these crimes, these incidents don't happen in the heat of a moment during an altercation really gets to that fact that when we're talking about survivors of domestic violence, sometimes it's a sustained fear that they are dealing with every day, day in and day out. And so I think that's sometimes why these incidents happen outside of a critical incident or an altercation, is because they're responding to that fear that they live with every single day of their lives.
I think that that's true.
And I was also really interested in what you said about motive. So why would domestic violence be a motive for homicide? Why was it seen as that?
So I think that there was a school of thought when this issue was less understood, that if there was domestic violence in a household, that was more of a personal issue. That was something that was between the members of that family, and people didn't really get involved in that too much in terms of the police. However, when you had a circumstance where the abused person ends up killing a perpetrator, I think that there was also a school of thought that perhaps this was revenge versus fear and protecting yourself.
Right.
And so I think that there were some people who looked at these cases, especially at that time, and they saw a malicious intent in terms of revenge. And I think what drove that in many respects is having a poor understanding of why people don't leave these circumstances.
Right.
So that's a huge issue. If you think that a person is free to leave whenever they want, and then there are no barriers to doing that, it's hard to understand why they decide to kill someone instead of leaving. Obviously, that's not as simple as it sounds. There are many barriers to leaving in these situations. And a lot of times folks feel like they had no choice.
Right, absolutely. And I think a lot of these cases that you were representing within the Clemency Project speaks to that issue of why, when people ask, why didn't she just leave? It's because they couldn't leave. They really felt that they were trapped in this situation, and the only way to get out was to stop the abuse, was to stop the abuser.
I think that that's right. I mean, you think about how that plays out in dynamics today, and then rewind to, 50 years ago, about how that would have played out when there is poor understanding, where domestic violence is an issue that people don't want to talk about. There aren't resources available. The coalition isn't doing its amazing work at that level. There isn't a shelter in town. You don't have anywhere to go. You're afraid to talk to anybody about this. And especially in one of my clients' cases, if you called the police, her husband was on the police force. Nobody's coming.
Right.
And if the police do show up, they're unlikely to get involved, and now you've set off your abuser.
Right.
So you have even fewer options, and it becomes a lot easier to understand why these circumstances play out the way they did.
Right. I think so many survivors feel so trapped in that relationship. And I'm so glad you mentioned that issue of when your abusive partner is a police officer, who do you call for help? So before we get ahead of ourselves on what happened with the case, with the whole project, which I definitely can't wait to talk about, but could you explain just the nuts and bolts of clemency in the state of Missouri? What does the process involve?
So there are only a few hard rules in terms of clemency in the state of Missouri. You have to submit a petition with whatever else you submit on a form. It covers very few areas. And then you can submit anything else that you want with it, basically, that could be considered. The parole board then will review the petition and make some recommendations to the governor, or look at what the sentencing guidelines were, what the institutional threat levels are of this person, basically a lot of the things they consider in the parole process. They provide that information to the governor, and the governor can ignore all of it, pay attention to it, or grant to clemency for any other reason that they think is a valid reason. There are really very few restrictions, if any, on this power of clemency.
So it sounds like the governor plays a very critical role in this whole process.
No question. All of this is to persuade an audience of one.
Interesting. The Missouri Battered Women's Clemency Coalition began meeting in 1999. How did the coalition identify cases that it was going to take? How did that process work?
So there was a lot of discussion within the coalition about different cases that had kind of come to their attention through different organizations or word of mouth, people reaching out from prison, that kind of thing. And they decided that they needed to come up with some kind of a theme, because that would make it a situation where you could present a more cohesive story and a more persuasive story ultimately about why this group of people should be let out of prison.
Mm-hmm.
And so they decided they wanted to, even though there were a lot of deserving people that folks within the coalition could and did end up representing, they wanted to keep the coalition to folks that had killed an abuser that lived with them. And they were looking primarily at women. At that time, the group was all women that was submitted in terms of people to look at. And they wanted to make sure that all of them had long sentences, life with or without parole, or a term. Some of them had life without parole for a period of 50 years. Significant sentences that would not have happened today.
Mm-hmm.
And that none of them had the opportunity to present evidence of the abuse of their trials, to kind of highlight the injustice of that issue. Mm-hmm. And so after a lot of vetting and discussions of the group of potentials, that ended up narrowing it down to 12 people that were represented the Clemency Project.
And then what was the next step once you all decided on the cases that you were going to take? How did you move forward after that?
The way it went from there is that individual law schools were kind of divvied out cases that, so that everybody kind of had as many as they could do with the size of their clinic. And I think that was also a reason to limit them so that they could get adequate attention and supervision of the law students that were going to be doing a lot of this work. And from there, we just all went to the prison. Each of us went with our respective teachers as students to the prison to meet our new clients, our first clients.
Wow. And so do you remember the first time that you went to prison to meet with a client? What was that like?
Yeah, I remember it vividly because it was the first time I had ever met with a client. So I hadn't met with any of my clinic clients yet. So this was the very first time I had ever met a real life client. And I had really built it up in my head, I think, not really kind of knowing what to expect. But the person I was representing, along with a partner and my professor, at that time, she had a big case file that was available to us, and I really kind of dug in because I wanted to make sure to ask all the smartest questions. It was being very academic with it. And then you show up to prison and you just have this moment of, what did I get myself into? It was like the old prison, just a very kind of reality experience that you just don't know what prison is like until you stay at prison. It was crazy. And you also can't get an idea of who somebody is now by looking at their case file from, many, many years ago. At that point, prison was unkind to her. It's a very hard way to live. She looked like a shadow of the person that there were photos of.
Uh,
Only been 10 years. Sounds like a long time, but it really isn't. And you consider how she looked. It was just
wow.
life.
Wow. Wow. But it also speaks to how important your role was as someone who was there to support her.
Yeah. And I think as a student, there's a little bit of an overwhelming feeling with that, where you realize, oh my gosh, this is a real person who's in prison and they're relying on me to get them out of here. And I don't know what I'm doing yet.
Yeah. Wow. That is a very significant undertaking, I will say.
That's when it hit me, what I had gotten myself into. I was like, this person is really depending on me and I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah, but I think sometimes taking off that just huge undertaking and that huge task gives you the opportunity to make such a huge difference that you wouldn't have if you hadn't stepped up to the plate and been up to taking on that kind of huge task.
Absolutely. I think that in all things, risks are necessary for success.
Yeah. Well, going back to 25 years ago, there was kind of an urgency to starting the Clemency Project because the governor at the time, Governor Mel Carnahan, was running for Senate and he was in his last term as governor. Can you talk about that situation a little bit as just an interesting part of history, another compelling piece of the story?
Yeah, I think there were two reasons that was important. One was he was leaving office as governor to either go on to the Senate. Oh, he didn't have any skin in the game politically in terms of being able to grant or deny clemencies after the election. There was a window where he was going to be leaving office. He would or would not go on to a different office, but he wasn't going to be governor anymore. That's a very likely time to have clemencies granted. The other reason is he had expressed interest in these, and his office was working with the coalition, some folks from his office, in terms of the things that were important to them and that they would like to see in some of the petitions. And so we felt like we had a very ready listener and audience for what we were doing. And so we wanted to get that to the governor as soon as we could so that governor would have adequate time and then kind of that magic window to grant hopefully as many as possible, but the ones that he decided were deserving. Obviously, plans have changed.
Yes, yes. And for our listeners who might not remember, can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, unfortunately, Governor Carnahan died in a plane crash before any of the clemencies could be ruled upon. And so that created a circumstance where the audience that we were hoping to present to was not the audience we were presenting to. There was an interim governor who had a very kind of short window that he was governor. He declined to do anything on that, and I understand why. And then whoever was the next governor, you worried that they would be concerned about running for office again or the political impact, and that maybe your soonest window could be 4 years after they're elected. So you were just looking at something totally different.
Wow. So I can imagine after that horrible tragedy happened that the Clemency Project really had to do some regrouping and figure out a new strategy.
To say the least, I think that the strategy, we picked the things that we thought were the biggest injustices in the cases, the biggest things that we thought merited clemency in the cases. And we thought that they would be something persuasive to a broader audience as well. It was a lot easier to kind of target certain issues when you knew who was going to be looking at them. And then you're starting all over from just trying to explain the issue to the new folks. So that was a different experience.
And your role in this process was putting together cases for individual survivors. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I did that as a law student. I put together a case for one of the women, along with a partner and my professor, and everybody put together cases for their women, and they were all presented in one group to the governor shortly before he died. So that was horrible. And then you have participated in trying to get them to rule on those clemencies and getting them to happen for some of the women.
And do you remember, as you were talking to the women, putting together cases, what were those conversations like? What were their thoughts around their own kind of clemency or hopes for the future?
Well, I was taught through this process and my professor, and it's something I tell young lawyers now, since I've been practicing law for a little while at this point, almost 25 years, that it should always manage expectations, right? Don't promise somebody you're going to get them out of prison, because you don't know if you're going to get them out of prison or not. And they think they're getting out of prison and they don't. That's worse than them never having a chance to get out of prison in some ways. It's a mean thing to do to somebody. So it's very important to manage the client expectations and to let them know that you are going to try the hardest you can. You're going to, climb the walls. You're going to dot all the I's and cross all the T's, but none of this is guaranteed. It's always a long shot. So
yeah, it truly is.
They had an understanding that this was a long shot. At least my clients did.
Right. I mean, I can imagine, certainly. And so how did you all move forward with the project after kind of things happened with the governor and there was a new governor? Did you continue to gather information for cases, or how did the story unroll after that?
We did. So at this point, I've graduated from law school, and I've gone on to a big firm to practice law. Sort of the magic of that was, I was in there with all the best and brightest lawyers who were very smart and went on to other positions where they could help me with some of these cases. And through a lot of different ways. It was kind of amazing how my big firm experience, I ultimately have been at 3 different large law firms here in town, the 3 biggest. And it was amazing how those experiences, each one kind of brought people into my circle that could help me with some aspect of these cases. And one lucky thing that happened was one of my colleagues, who we had been summer associates together at a big firm, ended up going on to be in the general counsel's office for the governor. And that gave me an opportunity to talk to him about what was happening with our cases and to try to get them to do something with them. And I also know that Milkarian was somebody very near and dear to him, that he respected and that everybody in that governor's office respected. And this was something important to him. Mm-hmm. And I think that gave it a lot of attention. Also, the law schools were so active and doing everything they could for all of the existing clients. Not every student who worked on them kept working with the coalition. I can only think of one other one from all the law schools. So there were a number of law students who cycled in and really did a good job for these women in terms of trying to get their petition kind of filtered to the top, draw attention to this issue, and to maybe get some relief for everyone.
So this was truly a collaborative process with many, many stakeholders involved.
Yeah, it was definitely what, we call the spaghetti tactics. You just throw it all against the wall and see what sticks. We just did everything, all of the things.
That is like winning advice for life. So just see what sticks. And
It's very,
eventually things did start to stick, and survivors were released, who had been incarcerated. Can you talk about how that happened?
sure. So through the original 12, after all of the efforts that everyone, two of them were granted clemency out of that group. One was my client, and then another client that had been represented, I believe, by Washington University, also was granted clemency by Governor Holden. But the kind of clemency they got was they both had life without parole, and they got life with parole.
Huh.
And to me, that was like the winning ticket, because what kind of person would look at all these horrible circumstances they were in? They had served so much time by this time, and think that they were a danger to society, or that there was some reason to keep them in prison. They had no violence in the institution. They had no other offenses. They were first-time offenders. And we really thought that it was just going to be a walk to the finish line. It was not. It was not a walk to the finish line.
So when you say that their sentences were reduced to life with parole, does that mean they still had to go in front of the parole board?
Correct. That means that they got the opportunity to go before the parole board. And the governor thought that granted the clemencies, thought that they would just look at them. It was kind of done in a rush on the way out of office. And he wanted somebody to like just thoroughly vet them and make sure that they weren't going to go out and offend, like the background, look at who they were, and make sure that they weren't some kind of a violence risk, essentially, where you have to worry about them leaving prison and killing people. And beyond that, he expected that they would be released. The governor basically directed the parole board that if these people aren't going to reoffend, you should release them. And so the parole board used that opportunity to deny them. And that's where the lawyers really got involved. Yeah, it was very disheartening.
Yeah, it seems like throughout this whole story, it was like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But that determination, and you all stuck with it and kept moving forward.
Yes, I think there were a lot of very determined people on the side of this issue that just like giving up wasn't a thought. You know what I mean? And there's also, you've worked so hard for these people. You don't want to let them down.
Yeah.
Unless you have taken every possible opportunity you can to get them justice and freedom in this case. You just don't want to have to look at them and tell them the justices don't let them down longer.
Right.
So,
And eventually, all the hard work paid off. And
it did eventually pay off. When I found out that this had happened, I talked to my former law professor, and the course of action was going to be to file a writ. She was going to use law students to kind of guide this writ through. I consulted where I could, and she ended up getting, for these two women, an order all the way from the Missouri Supreme Court saying that exactly what the governor had said. There were affidavits from the governor. There was everything that you can imagine, saying that he did not intend for them to just decide that they thought that the offense was bad and they were going to overrule them. He wanted them to just be looked at in terms of what is their institutional risk, what is their risk in society, and if it's low or non-existent, he wanted them released. And when it became about that, just like, are these women dangerous? There really was no grounds to deny the parole anymore. So they had to release them from prison.
Wow.
And that's exciting.
I'm sure you celebrated on those occasions. As you think back and women were released and they were able to go home to their families, do you remember what their response was or what they said that they were looking forward to once they were incarcerated?
Yeah, I mean, the response of some of the women, so those were the original two. I've represented other women that were part of the project that didn't get clemencies. I took some more after that. I really felt like this was an important thing and needed some lawyers that were out of law school that could have consistency to take it to ground instead of just new people coming in all of the time. So I took 2 more cases of the people that were left. Other people took cases. And also in the meantime, there were a couple of the women who had life with parole that had served so much time that they ended up getting paroled. Or I think one got a medical kind of release, those types of things. And so it was down at that point to the original, from the original 12, it had gotten down to 4 more that were left. And so I took 2 of them along. I teamed up with Mary Beck and Missouri, and then St. Louis University took the other 2, John Eamon and Patricia Harrison. And we just sort of put our back into it, and we're gonna kind of do what we could to get out. And clemency was a part of that, but there were many other things. And just seeing all of these people, when you've done that much time, at first you could tell there's like, when you tell them that this is going to happen, or when they first learn it, there's like this fear that maybe it's not happen, especially after all the things, this fear of being let down. And then you could see them kind of work through it and just sort of see the things that they have been thinking about the whole time that they were in prison. Like, I'm going to get to see my grandchild not in the prison waiting room. I can hug him as long as I want to. You know, I can eat warm toast because it's always cold in prison. Or, you know, they give them these little stubby toothbrushes that you can't even really clean your teeth with so that you don't stab somebody with it. And, you know, that's what they've been brushing their teeth with for over 30 years. And it's just hard to imagine the difference in your life and what's going to be, you know, the things. But I think for all of them, it was things like being able to hug their mom or hug their daughter or their grandkids, just being able to be with their family.
Yeah, it's so important. It's so important. I think I was just taken aback by thinking about those hugs and all of those important things that you were just speaking to. So
I counts in prison in the visiting room. If your family comes to see you, you can hug like a count of 5, and then you have to release, or you're going to lose your visit.
Okay, so 25 years later, you've got those 12 cases you worked on. How many of those survivors are still incarcerated?
All of them were released from prison eventually. We had another avenue with the other 4. There was some legislative help that made them eligible for parole. There were writs that had to be filed. We ended up suing the parole board like 3 different times. It was quite an ordeal. But at the end of the day, all of the original 12 were released from prison. And so then we found other women that deserved help.
Yeah, so the project came to an end and then continued to grow, is what I'm hearing.
But then the sequel.
Well, that is just an incredible story. And thank you so much for your hard work on that project. That really made a huge difference in these survivors' lives who got to go home and hug their families again. As you think back, oh, go ahead. Sorry, Amy.
I just said it was my absolute pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. As you think back over your experience, which spanned many years with the Clemency Project, are there any favorite memories that stand out to you?
Oh gosh, there are so many favorite memories that stand out to me in the project. It would be hard to pick just one of them, but probably just like a culminating sort of moment for me was I often will go back to my law school and talk about pro bono cases and how important it is as a young lawyer to go out there and help people that can't afford a lawyer and to build that into your practice from the very start, because it's something that is necessary. It's our professional obligation. It's also the best thing you'll ever do. So I was giving one of these speeches to try to convince people to go out there and do some good work with their law degree. And I looked out in the audience, and one of the women from the project was in law school.
My gosh. I just
She,
got like, oh, my heart just filled with like joy and happiness. That's incredible.
yeah, she had been released from prison. She had obtained clemency and went on to become a lawyer.
Wow.
And she was going to law school and she was there. I just kept looking. I'm like, she's really familiar because I did not represent her personally, and then I realized, and I was just like, do I know you? I'm sorry. Uh, she's so dead, yeah. And she didn't say much. So I didn't want to put her on the spot. But afterwards, I talked to her, and sure enough, she was going down this road and making something of her life, and she never would have had a chance to do that if someone hadn't helped her.
That's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah,
The impact of the Missouri Clemency Project, I think, has just been profound. And many, many survivors left prison, and a good handful of them started working at MOC ADSP member organizations as advocates supporting other survivors, which is
absolutely.
truly wonderful too. Well, I cannot end this conversation without asking you about the excellent documentary that you are featured in and interviewed extensively, The Perfect Victim. Can you tell us about your experience with that? And maybe if there's anything you think that the documentary got really right, or anything that you think that they maybe should have included that they didn't.
The documentary. It was a really fun thing to be a part of. It ended up being a bigger time commitment than I initially thought it would be because, I was a young lawyer. I was actually pregnant when I got this call that they were doing a documentary on the project, and understood that I was representing at that time two of the women from the project, that I had been in it from the beginning, and would I mind meeting with them for an afternoon just at my office to talk a little bit. And the one thing that I was concerned about was that I was 9+ months pregnant and ready to have a baby any day. So I'm like, it can only be this day, and then that's it. I can't do it after that. So they came up to my office and all the lights in this little tiny office. And, I had them shoot me from like here to here because I had this giant pregnant belly and was so hot. I could hardly stand it. Um, and just told them a little bit about what I did. And then I left. I turned off my computer. I went home, and then I had a baby the next day.
Wow, the next day.
That was gonna be it. I didn't know if they were really gonna make a documentary. People would ask for interviews and stuff for all kinds of things. And I just didn't know very much about it, but I really wanted to kind of spread the word about the women that we were representing. So whoever wanted to talk, unless it looked just like a really bad idea, I talked to them. And I had no idea that there would be many, many, many shooting sessions over the next 4 or 5 years. That they followed us all the way until those women we were representing ended up being released from prison, and then some of that. And so I thought that it got a lot of things very right, and they did a lot of work on it, and the people involved were very committed to it.
Yeah, it's an incredible documentary. It's called The Perfect Victim. I believe it's streaming on Amazon still and maybe available on YouTube as well. But it's just there's so much that went into this project, so much that went into the story. And I think the documentary just captures it so perfectly. As we think about the next 25 years of clemency and your work in the anti-violence movement, what are your hopes for the future?
My hope for the future with regard to this issue is that lawyers are not needed to fix this issue. I hope that it is an issue that there is more understanding, more resources, more opportunities for women to get help, so that nobody feels like they have to defend themselves with physical force to be able to get out of an abusive situation. That would be my biggest hope, is to put myself out of this business, in a word. But it's in terms of what I can do to help, any cases allowing a large continuum of things involving violence and abuse are things that usually I will volunteer to help out with, or people know where to find me. So
Yes.
that's
Yes.
what I do.
And you've gotten some fantastic recognition over the years, including the Missouri Bar Association Attorney of the Year, well-deserved recognitions. And I just want to say congratulations on all of that. And thank you for all of your incredible advocacy supporting survivors.
Thank you. It was a huge honor and continues to be that anyone kind of looks back at that law student that was there not knowing what they're doing and thought that she deserved an award. But it was amazing. It was an amazing experience. And it was so nice to see this issue be highlighted and our work be recognized.
Absolutely. Well, as we're wrapping up, is there anything else you wanted to be sure to speak to related to the Missouri Clemency Project and the 25th anniversary of this incredible work that you were very involved in over the last couple decades?
I would just like to thank all of the other people in the project who made everything that happened possible, from Joe Church, who got the idea, to all of the law professors, Mary Vack, my mentor, all of the students who went through the project and did their parts of the work, the coalition with all of the hard work they did on some of the legislative support that was received. From that all the way to being able to help folks when they got out of prison with some donations that had been given for that purpose. And just everyone who helped make it possible, the governors who granted some of the clemencies, the judges who stuck to end, the people on the parole board who finally did the right thing. I mean, it really took the entire state coming together to make it happen.
Wow, it really seems like it did. And thank you, Amy, so much for your time today and sharing a little bit about your experience with the project and your hard work. It's just been wonderful to be able to speak with you about these things. So thank you. Thank you, listeners, too, for tuning in. We certainly appreciate it. And we look forward to bringing you another episode of Momentum for Change next month. Thank you for joining us. This has been a recorded conversation, now available in both video and podcast formats. A video recording of this episode is available on the MOCADSV YouTube channel under the Momentum for Change playlist. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel in order to receive new episodes in your YouTube feed. You can also find all of our Momentum for Change episodes available to stream on Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts. Momentum for Change is a podcast produced by MOCADSV with post-production support provided by Tim Stillings and promotion by Adrian Maddox. Again, I am your host, Nora Mosby, and we appreciate you joining us for this episode. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next month.